listener production.
Hello, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Have you heard the claim that there's a serial killer running rampant on the New South Wales North Coast?
Imagine that was your sister, your mum, who disappeared and the police were saying, well, the file's empty. We can't find a record of anything we did to try and find your murdered loved one. That is absolutely appalling.
The theory has sent TikTok into a tailspin, but it's also being criticised for unfairly alarming people, especially women. In today's Deep Dive, we look into the very serious claims being made by independent MP Jeremy Buckingham. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It is Friday, November 1st.
Morning, Sasha. Morning, everybody. Almost 1/3 of all large companies who lodged tax returns in Australia last financial year did not pay tax. That's according to the Australian Tax Office's 10th Corporate Tax Transparency Report, which says of the 3,985 entities who lodged, 1,253 had a tax bill of $0. There are legitimate reasons a company might not pay income tax, like incurring an accounting or tax loss or using offsets, but the tax office says they're paying close attention to ensure no one's trying to game the system, with offshore tax havens being a key focus, Sash.
The report is yet to be made publicly available. It's just been shared with the ABC for now. But what it does show is the taxable income of all those involved in the report totaled $381 billion, with the office collecting $97.9 billion from those who did pay. Tax payable was dominated by the mining, energy and water sector, who made up $54.7 billion, followed by the wholesale, retail and services sector, which made up $19.1 billion. Now, as I mentioned, this was published by the ABC, so the ATO hasn't dropped the report yet. That should come soon. And in the ABC story, they didn't include the names of companies that haven't paid up for whatever reason. But if we look at the last transparency report put out by the ATO, we know oil giant Chevron paid just $30 of income tax in 2021-22, despite having a total income of $9.1 billion and a taxable income of $113 million. There were other companies which reported no taxable income for the financial year of 2020, despite posting massive revenues. That was Ampol, BP, Viva Energy Group, which owns Shell-branded petrol stations.
Yeah, and just picking up on, the wholesalers, retailers, which was the second sector paying tax, according to the ATO, Wesfarmers, so that's the owner of Kmart, Bunnings, Officeworks and Priceline, they yesterday announced $2.6 billion in returns after posting a $3.6 billion profit before tax, Sash. They had their AGM yesterday and its chair had some maybe controversial comments to say. He said, and I'll quote him here, he said, "For some, profit seems to be a dirty word, but it is important to understand how profitable businesses are essential to our economy and future prosperity," which are very interesting comments amid a cost of living crisis, of course. And just to break it all down, 29% of their profits went to tax, 61% went to shareholders, and the group has been left with about 10% for themselves.
Close to 60 million Americans have already cast their ballot ahead of next week's presidential election, which continues to run on a knife's edge. So the latest polls show neither Donald Trump nor Kamala Harris have a commanding lead in the key swing states of North Carolina, Pennsylvania or Michigan. And this comes after a turbulent couple of days on the campaign trail. There's been the fallout from Joe Biden's garbage comment about Trump supporters, which the Republican nominee has seized on, driving a garbage truck in high vis at an event yesterday, Chris.
And the issue of women's rights has been amplified by the Democratic nominee after the former president said this at the same rally in Wisconsin.
4 weeks ago, I was saying, no, I want to protect the people. I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. Why? They said, we think it's very inappropriate for you to say, so why? I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. Well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
Speaking to the media, Harris slammed the comments.
It actually is, I think, very offensive to women in terms of not understanding their agency, their authority, their right and their ability to make decisions about their own lives including their own bodies.
Harris's VP pick, Tim Walz, has also amplified the comments, saying he knows women will help defeat the Republican nominee, whether he likes it or not. Meantime, also happening in the US, Elon Musk, he's failed to front a court date in Philadelphia, Sash, and that's over his $1 million giveaway to Trump voters. That could put him in contempt of court because he's been ordered to show up.
And he didn't, so we'll see what happens with that. Look, we've seen a couple of celeb endorsements overnight. YouTube personality Jake Paul came out for former President Donald Trump in a new video on Thursday their time, so overnight for us.
For the love of God, go and vote for Donald Trump.
And we know Jennifer Lopez, who spoke out in support of Kamala Harris after the garbage comments, because J-Lo is famously Puerto Rican. She's actually going to attend a campaign rally with Harris today in Las Vegas.
Yeah, and fingers crossed we get similar moments to this.
Sorry, where was that?
That was at Joe Biden's inauguration.
Beautiful. Oh, here's hoping. Look, and keep the laughs going, because the President and the First Lady got into the Halloween spirit. So this happens every year, the President and the First Lady, or maybe next year it'll be the President and the First Man or First Gentleman.
Yeah.
What they do every year is they welcome trick-or-treaters to the White House on Halloween. And so Joe Biden and Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden did so. Jill was dressed as a panda.
Yeah.
Which it was just so strange, because they had these officials standing in front of them as the doors opened, and then they walked out and you see Joe in the suit and Jill in a panda suit.
Yeah, and to clarify, the suit is just Joe's regular suit.
Yeah, regular suit.
He
Didn't like paint a spiderweb on his face or like wear a witch's hat.
No.
He was just in his suit.
Yeah.
Jill was dressed as a panda. It was great. They reckon as many as 8,000 people, including students and children tied to the military, would pass through the White House gates during the day. So yeah, one of those little things that happens in US politics that's kind of sweet and kind of cute, which is so rare. And hey, with the countdown, we are 5 days to go.
And finishing up a massive week of news with a massive fine for Google in Russia. And it's so big, in fact, that it's worth more money than what there is in the entire world. A Russian court has fined the tech giant 2 undecillion rubles. That's a 2 followed by 36 zeros, Sash, for restricting Russian state media channels on YouTube. So to try to put that into terms we might be able to fathom, the fine is about 30 billion trillion Australian.
I still can't fathom it. I don't understand how many...
I've never heard those numbers in my life, Sash.
How many yachts can that buy me? That's all I want to know. Look, it is a number far greater as well than the entire globe's GDP, which sits at about $110 trillion. That has 12 zeros after it. And it is also far more... Somehow they've managed to make this fine dwarf Google's huge market value, which is $2 trillion. Look, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has admitted he can't even pronounce the number, but he has urged Google management to pay attention. Google has not publicly commented on the fine. It's worth noting Google does still operate in Russia, so locals can search it and use YouTube still, but they have filed for bankruptcy in Russia, and they've paused most of their commercial operations after the government seized control of its bank accounts. So in 2020, Google started kind of like clamping down on even like Russian state media on YouTube, but then they ramped up that activity after the invasion of Ukraine. So Russia's not a big fan of Google, but locals can still use it. So, good luck to Google. Maybe Google's going under.
I don't think Google cares, to be honest with you, Sash.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines. Look, next up, we are doing a deep dive into this theory that has kind of taken the internet by storm around this idea that there's been a serial killer operating on the New South Wales North Coast for decades.
The worst serial killer in the nation's history has gotten away with it. Ivan Milat was convicted of 7 murders. There is someone on the North Coast that has murdered as many or more, and they are still amongst us, if they haven't died or fled the country. The worst crime in our state's history is unresolved.
Is it possible that there's a serial killer wreaking havoc in Byron Bay? That's the question being raised by Jeremy Buckingham, Legalise Cannabis Party MP and member of the New South Wales Legislative Council. In an impassioned address to Parliament, he's made the case for the state to take a serious look at 67 missing or murdered women along the New South Wales North Coast between 1977 and 2009. But is this call-out alarmist? Is raising the question a sign that government and police are taking violence against women more seriously? Or do these accusations risk opening old wounds for the hundreds of friends and family members linked to each horrible disappearance and death? Jeremy Buckingham, welcome to the briefing. Tell me why you think these 67 deaths and missing persons cases could all be linked.
Well, what I think is that there's remarkable similarities between the type of victim and the modus operandi in a lot of these cases. Now, I don't think all of them are linked. I'm not suggesting that. I think that it's highly likely that we've got a number of individual crimes and perpetrators and victims that aren't linked. But if you look at just the total number, which is a staggering number, and the type of victim, the type of person that was subject to these crimes, and the modus operandi of the perpetrators, there's remarkable similarities, and you really don't see anywhere else in Australia this cluster of these types of crimes in such a small population. You look at the north coast of Queensland, south coast of New South Wales or Tasmania, similar demographics, similar population size. You just don't have these numbers of the same type of victim and crime. So I think it's highly likely that some are linked and therefore a serial killer.
There has been some criticism since you raised this that you're being alarmist by saying it's the possible work of potentially multiple serial killers. What's your response to that?
Well, I think what's alarming is that these crimes are unsolved and that there are remarkable similarities with many of them. I think that's the alarming thing, that even if these are all individual cases, it's an absolute stain on our society that we have not solved these cases, and some of them have been so poorly investigated. So if that's what people would prefer to operate under, sure, but I believe when you look at the cases, there are remarkable similarities. Women abducted from local roads, at the bus stop, walking home, and then they turn up sometimes years later, a body discovered in a remote area where you need local knowledge, and a similar type of crime. It's very rare to have that crime. It's incredibly rare to have that crime go unsolved. And so to have dozens and dozens of cases of it is utterly appalling. And criminologists are telling me it's highly likely that you have we've established there's causal links between these things, and criminologists are saying it's highly likely that this is a repeat offender for at least a significant number of them. Ivan Milat, he was convicted of 7 murders. I think it's likely, a reasonable person would see it as likely that many of these cases are linked, and therefore someone who's committing a crime on the scale of Ivan Milat has gotten away with it.
The interesting thing I've noticed since you've brought this up is the response of women, because I think, I speak myself as a woman who has felt that fear of walking alone at night or catching public transport by myself, and it has struck a chord with the community, especially women on the mid-north coast and the north coast of New South Wales. Multiple women have taken to TikTok and other social media sites to share their own experiences in the region and kind of share their own theories. It's clearly gotten a lot of people talking.
There are men going missing. There is a possible serial rapist that targets foreign women that aren't going to stick around and press charges.
With the situation that happened with me, the man just felt so experienced in what he was doing.
I have had friends that have been raped in Byron. I've had friends that have had their drinks spiked in Byron.
I don't know if it's multiple serial killers or if it's like a large organised group. But the way that my report was handled and the way that a lot of people in Byron felt about it or talked about it made me feel like there's a lot of people that know a lot more than they are letting on.
Do you feel this reflects that women in the community feel that their safety just isn't a priority for police and for lawmakers?
That is exactly what people are saying, and that the attitudes of police are are improving, and the resourcing they're putting into domestic violence and these types of crimes is a lot better than it was in the 70s, 80s and 90s. But we still have to hold the police to account for their failures in these areas. In an age when we're trying to stamp out violence in the community generally and really stamp out violence in terms of domestic violence and violence against women, we need to make sure that our police resources are going into the crimes that really matter, and that shouldn't be based on your postcode. Imagine if this number of crimes were unsolved and this type of most heinous crime had occurred in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or the northern beaches of Sydney or in inner Melbourne. There would be hundreds of police kicking down doors, taking names and shaking the truth out of these perpetrators. Well, that hasn't happened on the North Coast. And everywhere I went, everywhere I looked on the North Coast, there were another group, a community group, a family, an article in the newspaper where people were saying, what happened in our town? What happened to these 3 or 4 women? In the Clarence Valley, it's 12 around Grafton. Kempsey, another 3 or 4. Bellinge in my town, 3. Coffs, 3. And everywhere you looked, there was another community group saying, what happened to justice for my daughter, my sister, my mother? And they continue to make those calls. And until the government resources these investigations, then we've got a big problem. And that's what I met with the Premier last week and senior police and the police minister. And no one is prepared to stand up and say it's not true. No one's prepared to say this is what actually happened. And we've seen also that the police actually did have some task forces that were looking at these collectively. Well, I think they should redo those task forces again and redouble their efforts.
I'm wondering if what you're referring to in what your answer just before when you're talking about, I suppose, the lack of serious interest by police in these cases in this region, in the mid-North Coast and North Coast. Are you suggesting that potentially it's not just because there's a lack of concern about the women, but also women from a particular socioeconomic background or a particular racial background?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So many of these women were black, hippies, poor. They came from working class backgrounds. There was a class and a racial element to the types of women that disappeared. And that's one of the key things, that if this had happened in the eastern suburbs of a major city, then I think we would have had a much better outcome. And lots of these women were First Nations. Lots of them were, lived alternative or lifestyles, that sort of thing. They were out hitchhiking. They were catching the bus. They were walking home. They were coming home late. They'd been out partying or whatever. But that's their right. Good luck to them. They didn't deserve to die, and they needed the resources of the police absolutely thrown at this. And in many instances, families of murdered and missing women, they weren't interviewed for weeks or months after their loved one disappeared. In some cases, coronial inquests, there have been reviews of the evidence that have been gathered by the police. And in one case of Susan Kiley, her family was shocked to learn that there were no written records of her disappearance or any action the police had taken. So imagine that was your sister, your mum, who disappeared and the police were saying, well, the file's empty. We can't find a record of anything we did to try and find your murdered loved one. That is absolutely appalling, and it cannot stand. And I'll keep raising the issue in the Parliament until the resources are put in place. We look at all these crimes again, some of them collectively, and redouble our efforts because the victims and their families and the communities demand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can hear the passion in your voice, and I agree with you that it feels like a real disservice to these women. Let's talk solutions then. So you've said that there have been a number of task forces that have failed to kind of turn up any real true leads or solve any of these cases. What do you want to see happen aside from those being restarted and investigations kicked back off?
What I want to do is make sure that's on the agenda for the Premier. I want to make sure that we use the resources of the Parliament to, I've already passed a motion through the New South Wales Parliament to have all the documents relating to these inquiries brought back into the public view. I'll be looking at those. I'm taking a criminologist, a senior criminologist who I've been working on this case with, to meet with the Premier and prevent evidence and build our case that there needs to be resourcing of the police, a specialist strike force looking at this, resourcing of the unsolved homicide unit to make sure they've got the resources to investigate this. One of the suggestions has been that we reach out to retired and former police, both who are interested in the case, in these cases, involved in the cases, or who are, as I say, retired. They do that in the United States to get them involved in re-looking at the evidence, or in some instances, looking at the evidence collectively for the first time. So in so many cases, they didn't apply the best techniques in terms of DNA and comparing evidence. So I think we should build a database of these crimes, which I'm sure they already have, but start doing the cross-referencing and cross-checking of what happened where, who was where, what happened, and apply, all hands to the press to make sure that we get a result in at least some of these cases.
Jeremy Buckingham, it's been a really interesting chat. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please do keep us updated on your progress on this, because I think it's worth following.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention. It's what will hopefully bring a better outcome for in some of these cases. I really appreciate you focusing on it, because it's a critical issue, delivering justice for these communities and these families.
Jeremy Buckingham, Legalise Cannabis Party MP, speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, if you got something out of this ep, found it really interesting, we'd love it if you could share this with someone else in your life who's a true crime fan. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.